Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Food System Solution webinar series. Today's topic for the series will be applying systems thinking for food systems transformation. As everybody settles into the room, and before we begin our session, I just want to go over a few notes with everybody. First of all, this session will be recorded and it will be shared publicly. We will follow up with all who registered for the event with these recordings and other important documents. As today's event is interactive, we do encourage you to keep your camera open if that option is available for you. However, please keep yourself on mute unless called upon to take the floor. This ensures everybody can hear what's going on. If you would like to take the floor during the interactive segment, we ask that you click the raise hand button on Zoom. We also encourage you to use the chat for the entirety of today's session. This can be to ask questions, post comments, and share documents with everybody in the group. And finally, we ask that you rename yourself on Zoom to start with your name and then your organization. This will facilitate us being able to call upon you to take the floor or answer your questions directly in the chat. And without further ado, I'd like to kick today's session off by handing the floor to FAO's Chief Scientist, Isman Alofi. Ismana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Abigail. Welcome everybody to this webinar on food system solutions, applying system thinking for food system transformation. And we hear once a while some noises or some voices. So if we could just minimize it, please. Yeah. So distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, it is really my pleasure to welcome you all today to the Food System Solution webinar, Applying System Thinking for Food System Transformation, that is hosted today by the UN Food System Coordination Hub, that is hosted within the FAO as an organization. Today, we are here to delve into critical topic, the importance of system thinking in transforming our food system and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. In our world today, and we all agree on it, we are really confronted with unparalleled challenges that spans climate change, biodiversity loss, hunger, and inequalities. To navigate these challenges successfully, we must embrace a holistic approach, one that recognizes the interdependencies between sectors and that seeks integrated solutions. In an ever-evolving world, we need to adapt and innovate to create sustainable change. And that is exactly what we are aiming to explore today within this webinar through the lenses of the nexus approach. So harnessing the power of system thinking empowers us to unlock the full potential of agri-food systems, accelerating progress across a spectrum of interconnected issues.
Ma première fois dans les mers va être les prochaines.
Somebody, colleagues, if you could unmute yourself, or maybe if the IT person, Ludovica, if you could mute people, because as they come in, they don't tend to unmute directly. Apologies for this, colleague. But what I was saying is that really we need to harness the power of system thinking, and we need really, and that's only by doing so we can really unlock the food potential of agri-food system in terms of accelerating progress across the spectrum of interconnected issues. Agri-food systems are not just about nourishment and sustenance. They are a fundamental cornerstone in creating a sustainable future. I always say we all eat, we all need food. So that makes the 9 billion people really as an active participant in the agri-food system. But when we look into the workforce, we have numbers that shows that as much as 3 billion people are employed within the agri-food system. So this sector is vital. It's very important towards achieving the Global Development Agenda 2030 and achieving a sustainable future. So today we have a great panel of experts that will share their experiences and insight on food system thinking. They will share practical examples of system thinking in action, and they will explore with us how this can be leveraged to achieve the SDGs. So one of the key objectives of this webinar is to bridge the gap between the theory and the practice when it comes to system thinking. Many policymakers view system thinking as a theoretical concept, and our panelists are here to shed light on how it can be operationalized for effective decision-making and policy implementation. We will also delve deeper into the element of agri-food system that needs to be prioritized in our efforts to make them more sustainable. By examining the interconnectedness between agriculture, nutrition, health, and the environment, we can identify the key areas where targeted intervention can have the greatest impact. And we will all agree that impact is necessary as we are very close. We are only about 7 years away from the 2030 development agenda with this great and ambitious SDGs. Furthermore, intergovernmental processes can promote a system thinking approach for the global governance of food system by fostering collaboration, sharing best practices, and aligning policies. With all of this, we can create an enabling environment that supports the transformation of our agri-food system. So throughout the webinar today, we aim to foster a vibrant exchange of ideas, enabling us to understand better what a system thinking is and how could it be used within the agri-food system sector. Our collective expertise and diversity of background are sure to enrich our conversation and contribute to the development of effective strategies for sustainable food future. Once again, most welcome to this webinar. And let me now introduce our 3 esteemed panelists. So first we have with us Dr. Livia Bizikova, and she is the lead in monitoring and governance in the International Institute for Sustainable Development from Canada. And she has a very deep experience in the fields of sustainable development, scenario development, participatory planning, and integrated assessment. We have with us also Dr. Tom Arnold, who currently serves as a board member of the Global Food Banking Network, the Global Panel for Agriculture and Food System for Nutrition, also the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition and GAIN, the Malibu Montpellier Panel, and many more. In his previous roles, he served as Ireland's Special Envoy for Food System 2021-22, and he was also the chair of Ireland 2030 Agri-Food Strategy Committee, which produced the Food Vision 2030 that was launched in 2021, and I was really honored to be with you, Tom, during the launching of that Food Vision 2030 for Ireland. We have also with us Dr. Kwesi Atakra, who currently serve as a senior advisor and consultant, country and regional engagement of the One CGR, and within IITA, hosted by IITA, and Kwesi has been with the CGR since 1984. So let me start with Livia. And actually the same question is for the 3 panelists. So let me start with you, Livia. For many policymakers, system thinking sounds a very theoretical concept. How it is operationalized from your perspective? Over to you, Livia.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. And it's a great pleasure to be here and also to talk about such a topic from a practical point of view. I think it's very important, as it also was mentioned, that one thing is the make a rationale for using system thinking. Other question is how to make it useful from a policy making point of view, or from creating strategies that can improve food system governance and elements of the food system within a reasonable time frame. So overall, for me, like the issue of system thinking, for me, kind of the most practical, action-oriented approach would be to think of an approach that is holistic approach to problem solving. So we are trying to solve problems in a system by connecting the system elements and looking at linkages, trade-offs, and also looking at unintended consequences that cascade through a very complex system. So if we try to influence A, we don't know how it goes through the elements of the system and what kind of changes it can cause, both sometimes positive, sometimes negative. So in this way, we can see system thinking as some sort of a diagnostic tool, which would help us understand the elements of the system and these linkages that are very hard to understand, making these connections often without a quantitative model or some sort of quantification of the elements of the system. And so from this point of view, and we already talked about this, how we can use it. While we can say that every food system is unique, system thinking could allow us to find types of solutions that work in most types of systems. We, even from a policymaking perspective, we think of certain type of policy measures that we can consider. And I think using system thinking could help us to place these policy measures into, if we want to change a system that has this type of elements, these types of measures would be useful. And then they can be modified for the specific national level. So I don't think every system or every food system needs their own system model or their own system thinking approach. And so in this context, kind of the last thing what I would like to say, that from a policymaking point of view, the critique towards system thinking could also be coming from the approach that is very based on natural resources, very based on, models that link agricultural change, forestry, water resources, sometimes biodiversity, but it's very complicated to measure. But so it's kind of a natural science approach with a little bit of, let's say, costing. But because we have a tradition now for, let's say a few decades using this approach, we can also see that there is a lot of attempts to try to address inequality, try to include, for example, access to resources, try to address marginalized groups. So there are efforts to make also these type of system approaches more inclusive and more add the social dimension to the thinking. And this way also be more relevant for policymaking instead of just having a very, natural science focused modeling quantitative approach. So from my perspective, it's definitely useful. It definitely offers solutions, but we need to be very careful how we use it so that that relevance of policymaking remains.
Thank you very much, Livia, and thank you for really clarifying that although we have context-specific system thinking around the agri-food system, still there is a common area that we can use all of us together. And thank you also for clarifying that there is a need for more social components in our models and our system thinking. I'm going to move to Tom with the same question. So how do you think we can operationalize system thinking within the agri-food system? And maybe, Tom, if you have an example, a tangible example to share with us, given that you were leading the file of food security in Ireland for many years in different capacities. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Ismahan. I think it's very important to be very practical here and to think to answer that question, how do you operationalize this concept? In the Irish context, I think we started with an advantage that the strategy that I chaired was the fifth such strategy since 2000, stakeholder-led strategy in developing a national strategy. And so when we started in January 2020, just before COVID, we agreed at the very beginning that we were going to use a food systems approach to develop the strategy. And that was very important. And in explaining why we wanted to use a food systems approach, we made the obvious point of the strong interconnectedness between production side, consumption side, the environmental section, and health. They were the core elements that we said had to be taken into account in framing the strategy. The other key insight, of course, using food systems is that if you're working towards a sustainable food system, you have all the players along the chain have to contribute. So that core insight at the beginning became very important. And then, of course, you do get back to the fact, as was just said, that every national food system is different. So one has to then identify within the national food system that you're talking about, what are the really core elements that need to be addressed? And in the Irish case in 2020, the background was that over a previous 5 to 10 years, there'd been a big expansion of dairying, which had achieved something on the economic and sustainability front, but had caused some problems on the environmental front, in terms of water quality, in terms of biodiversity, and in terms of emissions. So confronting that challenge, that direct challenge, and coming up with strategies to deal with that was central to the work we set out to do. The other area, which was really an innovation from an Irish point of view, was we wanted to introduce the notion of the link between nutrition and health. And we built that into the strategy. So at the end of our work, 18 months later, we had come up with a strategy which had 4 core missions, 4 core, if you like, policy directions that we had set down, we had got agreement on, and subsequently the government agreed as well. And those 4 were having a mission to a climate-smart, environmentally sustainable agri-food sector, a viable and resilient primary producers with enhanced well-being, because we had to take into account that environmental sustainability has to go hand in hand with economic and social sustainability. Thirdly, the issue of food that is trusted and valued at home and abroad. And fourthly, an innovative, competitive and resilient agri-food sector driven by technology and talent. We felt they were the core directions if we were going to go in the direction by 2030 of having Ireland as a leader in sustainable food systems. And that, if you like, was the outcome of our strategy. Of course, circumstances change, and there will have to be further challenges and developments of this strategy as you go along. But I think in terms of a core document, this was widely accepted and is now being implemented. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom, for shedding light. How did you do it in Ireland, and how it was actually a number of strategies since 2000, but really the 5th one that was developed in a different way based on the whole agri-food system. Thank you very much for sharing with us your experience. And let me now move to Kwesi. And Kwesi, the question to you as a scientist and a researcher, how do you see really the operationalization of system thinking in the agri-food system?
Yeah, thank you very much, Ismahan. And it's a pleasure to be part of this discussion. Obviously, one thing that we all hold is the fact that when we talk about the food systems, there is the issue of complexity. We are dealing with a very complex issue. And it basically implies that there are several different facets to it, and there are several different interests, and there are several different expertise that are involved in this. And I think one central theme that draws us all together is the fact that it's not just a question of bringing different elements together. It's the issue of being able to show what the synergy that comes out of that exercise, so that there can be clear. You can bring all these elements together in a way that enables synergistic outcomes. Oh my goodness, this place is a bit noisy. I hope you can hear me okay.
No, we hear you fine, Kwesi. We can hear you fine. Yeah, we don't hear any noises. Go ahead.
Oh, excellent, very good. So you would have this scenario where, as we bring all the necessary elements together, you begin to see there are 2 options that can result in terms of outcomes. You can have outcomes that bring about synergy. And I think those elements are the incentives that causes us all to come together, because we begin to see that we are in a scenario where the whole must be more than the sum of the parts. Now, So if you bring together all the elements and you don't deal with the issue of how, then you can result in disynergy, where basically you begin to get negative synergy coming out. So in the context of the CG system that I have been working in for quite a while, you would know there are quite a number of centers. Right now, there are 12, 13 centers, and each developing a food systems strategy based on their own. Now we realize that wasn't the most helpful approach. So bringing the different teams together, first of all, to agree on the global challenges that we are going to focus on was critical. So once as a group you focus on food systems, then the question really is, how do we then operate together? Given that people will still remain in their boxes, they will still remain in their institutions, they will still remain in their departments. But how do you then create this program which enables us to work together? And I think that is something that is very, very, very important as we are talking about food systems, especially in scenarios where we're looking at governments and looking at ministries. We do know there are different ministries and each ministry has their own mandate, but these mandates are cross-cutting. So often it is important to establish some cross-cutting committees, some cross-cutting groups, etc., that enables the various elements to work together. From this perspective, the interest in food systems transformation now reflects that we are not very happy with the emergent properties coming out of our efforts thus far. And why are we not happy? Because instead of desired properties such as nutrition, such as the actual food security, such as wealth creation, environmental sustainability, we see that our food systems generates malnutrition. It is still generating food insecurity, environmental challenges are still there. And those are some of the elements that tell us that we are not doing what we need to do. If we're going to reach the positive elements of food security, we definitely need to come together and make sure that we are bringing all the energies together and in delving at reaching the synergistic outcomes that we all wish to achieve. So I think in this opening segment, I will put a strong emphasis on the thought process, making everybody agree that we cannot solve the issue of food systems working as an independent, in our own little institutions or programs. We definitely have to come up with a mechanism of coming together and putting thought processes together so that we can agree on what each person is going to do in moving the whole system forward. Thank you, Ismahani.
Thank you very much, Kwesi. And maybe I'll come back to you to tell us from your perspective, from the research sphere, how could we make sure that researchers and institutions work together with an inclusive and a very interconnected agri-food system? As you said, thank you for reminding us that we are really far from all the SDGs, particularly SDG 2, zero hunger. And that's indeed within our 8 billion population right now, we have more than 821 million people that are still hungry, which will really show how far we are. So let me move to Tom now with the second question. And maybe, Tom, you can give it to us as it relates to the Irish model, or maybe also your role with the EU, looking at the high-level expert group for food systems, for food system science. So what are the elements of agri-food system that need to be prioritized in our efforts to make them more sustainable? I hear from you, Tom, that for the strategy, the 2030 food strategy, you involved everybody. So when you involve everybody, are you diluting the importance of some groups versus others? Or from your perspective and your experience, what are the most important elements? And how could you make sure that those elements are the ones that have the strongest voice and that they are addressed when we talk about the integrated solution and system thinking? Over to you, Tom. You are muted, Tom. You need to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry for that. Yeah, I think the critical thing is, obviously, I think you do need a truly representative group on the stakeholder group, which is responsible for developing the strategy. And in our case, there were 32 people, and I think they were indeed representative of all the parts of the value chain, and they all contributed. So having signed off the strategy, and it having been agreed by government, then the next thing is obviously starting its implementation. And here I think governments have a very important role in sustaining a momentum towards implementation. So, and if I could just give two examples in the Irish case, in the case of water quality, which was seen as a really important issue, there's been an exercise over the last number of years where the areas which had the real water quality challenges were getting specialist attention with additional advisory extension resources put in, working closely with farmers, but also bringing the other key player into a role, which is the milk purchaser, the food company that's involved in that. And food companies are now increasingly putting in place a range of sustainability measures which farmers have to comply with in order to sell their milk. So it's that business of a multi-approach to really tackle a problem as difficult as water quality. On the issue of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, how do you deal with that? Again, our national research body has put in place an accelerated and well-resourced program to come up with new answers for that, to deal with that problem. So I think, again, you go back to you're setting a big, important national objective, but it really has to be followed through with other more detailed initiatives which have to still engage the farmer, the researchers, the government, and business. So that as a general approach, I think, is important. And then this other thing, and the final thing I would say, is that it's crucially important that, having agreed a strategy and set down certain targets, that those targets are honestly monitored and reported upon. So in Ireland, we have an implementation scheme whereby on an annual basis, all the commitments that are made in our Food Vision 2030 strategy are reported upon. And that's a very public approach. So you can see what's working, what's not working, and what has to be accelerated. So that is, as a general approach, is how I would try to answer your question, Ismahan.
Thank you very much, Tom, again, to really bring it to a very tangible example and how you did it in Ireland. So from the element of the food system, what I heard from you, it's really having all the players. Is there any other element in the agri-food system that you need to make sure they have to be prioritized? I heard a lot, the sustainability, the environmental footprint. So given the example in dairy, how much do you balance nutrition versus climate versus income and so on and so forth?
Well, I think you're trying to, we had as a basic underpinning of the strategy that there had to be a balance between economic, environmental, and social sustainability. And we set out measures to work in terms of achieving all of these. One area where it was truly an innovation for an Irish sectoral strategy was to bring the focus to nutrition and health. And that's an area which requires collaborative working between ministries of health, ministries of agriculture, and others. And that's an area where I believe we haven't made as much progress as we should have done. And that's an area which as we proceed in implementing that strategy, that's an area that I would like to see a more concentrated focus on.
Perfect. Thank you, Tom. So moving to you, Kwesi. From your perspective, what are the elements of agri-food system that we need to prioritize in the system thinking approach?
Yeah, thank you. I think Tom has raised some very, very important elements, but just to add to that, it is so vital that we recognize the importance of diversity, diversity between food systems, but also diversity between the actors in the way we view the system and the different purposes and interests they have. Because sometimes you bring these actors together and you talk about food systems in a broad generic sense, but each of these actors may come to the table with their own specific interests for participating in that grouping. So food systems, as we see it, we recognize that it includes many stakeholders, not just the researchers, but you have to look at the whole spectrum from research all the way down to the point when the food consumption elements come in. So you have to see the role of different sectors, the private sector engagement, the farmer association engagement, and not just focusing on the research issue, because research without delivery doesn't solve any problem. So in looking at food systems, we have to look at the entire spectrum. So you have the research element with all the stakeholders that have traditionally been working together, dealing with the research issues. But now, for a research institution, one also needs to recognize that beyond research, you have the delivery, you have the extension, you have the agents that are responsible for all these elements. And so we have to have a system that recognizes that these are two wings that have to work together, the delivery side and the research side, and each has a number of specific stakeholder groups that have to come together. And sometimes we talk about the multi-stakeholder platforms, for instance, where you set up specific mechanisms, having identified the different groupings that impact on the food system. You need to have some funding for bringing these together in the sense of a platform to deliberate on issues, so we can understand what the specific interests of all these groups are and how we can negotiate and navigate that complexity. Sometimes people talk about innovation platforms. That's an instrument that has also been used very extensively, and that involves involving local people, communities, farmer groups, women groups in addressing specific solutions that target the environment where they are in. So this is something that I feel is an important ingredient, the whole diversity, not just between the food systems, but also between the actors. And there has to be mechanisms that enables, excuse me.
Yes, sir, if you don't mind, we're going to open up the restaurant and activate.
Okay.
So you want to go downstairs? Or
Yes, Kwesi. So maybe I move on to Livia. Thank you very much, Kwesi, for stressing.
I have to relocate.
For stressing the diversification of actors, of food systems, and of everything around agri-food system, but particularly actors. And you clarified very well, and you mapped very well the actors along the whole agri-food system. So moving to you, Livia, from your perspective, what are the elements of the food system to be prioritized? Because we heard a lot on the actor side, but I would like really as a researcher in the subject to tell us from your perspective, is there other element than really the inclusiveness around the actors and the different stakeholders? Over to you, Livia.
Thank you. I think the two speakers covered a lot of the important parts of the system and what needs to be focused on. I would add a very specific few things. So I think what happened for the last 2 years by designing and countries submitting their food system transformation strategies is that these are really relatively well and sometimes absolutely excellent participatory process outcomes. But what we are seeing, and we are just getting a paper out about this like in a few weeks, is that there is a difference between what are the priorities in these strategies that were submitted and what are the national policy priorities. So very often, what was also mentioned in the in the food system strategy transformation document, there are often a very strong focus on nutrition, very strong focus on food security, much less focus on the performance of the agricultural sectors. There is some focus on environment and specific aspects, and even when we look at the agricultural performance, it's, let's say, often very specific issues like access to storage, for example, access to certain type of inputs. And so from a government point of view, who has been doing, you know, all kinds of agricultural strategies, let's say in a certain like 3 years, 5-year basis, these things not completely overlap. So there is definitely a space in terms of, you know, to both for the food system strategies to be inspired by some of the government strategies and some of the government strategies taking on priorities that were outlined in these food system strategies. And then that comes to implementation in a way that it comes to allocation of resources. While even, you know, most of those priorities that, let's say, are mentioned in the food system strategies are often, even if it may be in a minor way, but somewhere listed in the government priorities, especially when we are talking big words like climate smart agriculture, you know, addressing food insecurity, like who wouldn't want to address food insecurity? But then when you look at the allocation of resources, how this manifests in actually what we do and how the governments invest, or how, you know, donors invest, that's basically where the priority happens on the ground, because there where projects go and, you know, basically financial support comes. So I think one critical part would be to looking the elements and the overlap between what the food system strategies are saying, what the government actual priority documents are saying, how best to align them, and what are those measures, let's say, that are already being considered, but also measures that can be inspired by the food system strategies to be included or prioritized within these actual strategies. Because as I say, they are often there, but they are just very, very low priority.
Thank you very much, Livia, for reminding us that really the national priorities are almost more realistic. They are much more tangible, maybe, and they are very much linked to allocation of resources, which the global strategies tend to underplay. So when it comes to resources, then you have the stakeholder that both Tom and Kwesi has been mentioning that need to have seats around the table so that they bring in their perspective, and then both the prioritization is done with everybody's views, and consequently also the resource allocation is done. I like very much your example on how sometimes we focus on the nutrition and climate and environmental at the global level, but when it comes at the national level, then you see other more maybe important aspects to that country to come up, be it access to resources, to storage, to seeds, or to other areas. So that's how, in our perspectives, I want to just make a pitch here for the strategic framework of FAO, where we put the 4 betters. We put our strategic framework around better production, better nutrition, better environment, and better life. And the idea we did, Livia, there is that those 4 betters are very important, but the percentage could change from country to country. In Ireland, we heard from Tom that climate smart agriculture was a high priority. So environment was there with reinforcing. So that percentage between the 4 better could be context specific and based on the national strategies. And that takes me really to the 3rd question. I'm going to start with you, Kwesi. So given that we try to explain better what's the system thinking approach is, what are the main elements of the agri-food system in a system thinking that should be prioritized. So this next question for you, how intergovernmental processes can promote a system thinking approach for global governance of agri-food systems? So where do you see the intergovernmental processes helping us really to get to a system thinking approach? Over to you, Kwesi.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hani. And at key, there are scenarios where you could have interministerial committees set up within one country, focusing specifically on the issue of food systems. And that recognizes the fact that the different ministries within the country are touching on different aspects. It's basically this whole thing about the 7 blind people and the big elephant, and everybody has an element to it. But setting up that interministerial committee enables the issues to be discussed in an integrated manner. And oftentimes these committees have to be placed in a unit within the government that enables this cross-cutting nature to function. Sometimes it may be in the office of the prime minister, or it may be in some other organization. So it's not necessarily always within the Ministry of Agriculture. It could be in a structure that is even beyond the Ministry of Agriculture, because agriculture itself has a key role to play in there. You have countries where livestock is not even in the Ministry of Agriculture. So all these elements have to come together through some formal groupings that enables these issues to be discussed. So I really think that where there are intergovernmental processes, the issues that we have talked about as vital for food systems need to be addressed. The issue of creating and supporting variation, capturing and supporting existing diversity, recognizing it and having mechanisms to capture them. Temporary protection of niche level initiatives. And these are initiatives of different groups that are aimed at strengthening the food system. So basically having the mechanism that enables such initiatives to be supported. And that includes specific research areas that are identified as addressing gaps in the food system so that they are addressed. So you have funding for a specific issue, and you may have different institutions that are contributing to solving that. Last two is the whole issue of fostering landscape level pressures and active regime destabilization. So bringing the thought process not only in terms of looking at particular land areas, but looking at broader landscape level processes and identifying plausible leverage point for solving this. And all these are issues that have to be discussed at the joint ministerial level, interministerial level, and also making use of intergovernmental processes that would exist in a particular country.
Thank you, Kwesi. Over to you, Livia, and maybe we want to have some time for Q&A. So how intergovernmental processes can promote a system thinking approach for global governance of food systems? Livia, over to you, and then Paul. You are muted, Livia. So, yeah.
Sorry, apologies.
Thank you.
Kwasi talked about the structure of the ministries and how issues can be very separated. I think from the kind of the intergovernmental processes, or one critical thing would be to really assist governments in terms of where are those gaps or where are the opportunities to address, compare, in the context of their food system transformation priorities. And let's say now, because we have so many countries submitted their priorities, we can start looking at what is kind of the basic system approach would entail in these strategies and what are the missing parts or what are the gaps. Let's say they are, of course, every country would, everybody please, we are somewhat different, but we are also somewhat similar. And for many countries, the challenges are quite comparable, but the implementation would differ a bit depending on the context. So I think especially from intergovernmental organization, there can be a lot of help provided to countries to help them to see where are the potential gaps, where are the elements of the systems that are overlooked, or where are the major trade-offs in these strategies. And of course, the financial part is the easiest one because you have a limited pot of money that has to be split. But there are also issues, as we discussed earlier, that may be overlooked, that there is rightly so a very strong focus on nutrition, but much less focus on production. There is much more focus on climate-related issues, much less focus on, let's say, biodiversity-related issues, and how these things can be put back into that food system transformation strategy so that it's really promotes sustainability and kind of the balanced approach to development. And I think here, because there is a robust body of submitted strategies that has been done collaboratively in the countries, I think research institutions, intergovernmental organizations, and can definitely help synthesize and help countries to see the gaps that they can then contextualize it into their specific context and specific way how to address that issue. And that also offers learning in between countries and you know, from different measures kind of addressing the same challenge.
That's very good. That's definitely one of the roles that really many intergovernmental organizations try to play in terms of supporting countries and providing that peer-to-peer learning or country-to-country learning. Tom, do you have anything to add for the how intergovernmental processes can promote a system thinking approach for global governance? Yeah. Yes,
I do. And I think, firstly, it's important to recognize that intergovernmental processes already have made a major contribution here. And I mean, this key starting point was the Secretary General's initiative to call the Food System Summit for 2021 on the clear understanding that sustainable food systems were absolutely of central importance to achieving both the SDGs and the Paris Climate Agreement. And the fact that we've had just last July a stock-taking moment to see how far countries have delivered on their commitments was another important step. So I think that whole process of absolutely institutionalizing food systems thinking at national and international level is really the right direction to go, and has to be further built on in the next stock-taking moment in 2 years' time. But there's one other area of intergovernmental process which I'd like to say represents a huge opportunity in the near future, and that is COP28. I mean, COP28, for the first time ever in the COP process, a COP presidency has talked about the importance of linking policies for climate and food. And that every country going to COP is going to have to think, what are we bringing to that debate? And so I think there is a definite synergy between the work already that has been done in terms of the food systems approach at Food System Summit level, and now as we connect that work to if you like, the next perspective, which is how we all look at the whole way in which climate and food policies have to be get much greater priority, more resources, but most importantly of all, a clear focus. And I would see COP28 as a starting point for what should be a multi-annual approach to tackling this problem.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you for actually giving credit for what happens within the UN system, but also the connection at the COP between food and climate. And it's good to see that interconnectedness recognized at the global level, but we need it at the regional level and the national level, where we see a lot of discrepancies depend on the countries. But definitely, we had a huge development, I would say, in the last 3 years between England, Egypt, and now in the UAE, whereby there is a recognition of the importance of agri-food system as part and parcel of adaptation to climate change. And also there is the component of loss and damage that was brought in to really clarify how could we work together globally while preserving the national agendas and the national strategies. Thank you very much, Tom. And with that, we finish our 3 main questions, but we have received a number of questions in the Q&A. I have one for Tom, followed by one for Kwesi and one for Livia. So Tom, food system transformation has costs that have to be paid by some in the food system. How do you deal with interest? How do you deal with it when food system transformation hurts, when there are unexpected consequences and trade-off? Over to you, Tom.
I mean, the cost issue is obviously a huge factor. I mean, in our strategy, it wasn't a strategy that attempted to spell out the full costs in detail of what we were proposing. But what I saw, the purpose of the strategy was to get this agri-food strategy higher up the national agenda. And after that, then the cost issue is going to have to be dealt with. I had a mentor at one stage with a very simple message. He said, priorities equals resources. And so I think where you have key priorities, then that has to be translated into both, really sensible policy priorities, but then backed up by resources. The other factor, I think, is that this costs are not always about, what the government can contribute in budgets. There's going to have to be the role of the private sector has to play a key role here, and how they can work collaboratively with farmers to achieve certain things, for example, to achieve higher sustainability standards. So I think the whole cost issue has to be seen in a much broader framework than just the simple cost of what it takes to achieve. How do you connect government, private sector, and farmers to work together on this issue?
Thank you very much, Tom. Olivia, do you have any experience to share with us, maybe either from the Canadian perspective or any of your IISD research on how do you deal with this resource allocation issue?
Maybe just 2 sentences. Absolutely. So engagement of private sector is critical. The other part is that, when we say we are feeling, trade-offs and negative consequences, we are facing trade-offs and negative consequences, in the food system for many, many decades. So we do have experience with that, and we are still here. So I think much more, let's say, doing, let's say, pilot testing, trying policies on a small scale, even Kwasi mentioned kind of an incubator approach, would help for places to experiment both in the private sector and, let's say, linkages with smallholders or new government approaches. But I think our world is full of trade-offs that, didn't go that well. That's why we have challenges that we have. So using that as the non-action kind of excuse, I think it's really hard to take. But on the same side, there are a lot of examples, and especially, let's say, intergovernmental agencies come often with a lot of examples what can be done. But that is the issue of timing. We haven't talked about that, but part of this system thinking is when there is a window of opportunity from a policy making to change something, when there is a champion, when there is the strategy being revised. So there is also that link between the intergovernmental and the governmental agencies and with their counterparts on when to make the change. And I think, so sometimes I think a lot of things are known and available, but we are just they just come in not in the right time. And I don't want to take the time.
Over to you, Kwasi, and in this exact discussion, I remember one of the ministers told me that the GDP, agriculture GDP, it's not really reflective of reality. Whereby in the GDP, national GDP, what we have, it's the production side, but not so much the rest of the food system. And hence, that's provide always a smaller budget to the ag sector. So there is really the economics particularly has to be adjusted if we're thinking system thinking approach. Kwasi, to you, how do you see it from your perspective based on your research? Is there anything that you can share with us to help us move towards more system thinking approach? You are muted, Kwasi.
We never get used to this. Yeah, no, it's a very important element, because when it comes to budgeting and it comes to resource provision, a lot of it still goes into specific sectors. So sometimes you have the resources allocated to different sectors, and yet we are talking about the importance of working together. So in those instances, when you meet in a food systems context and you are talking about the importance of synergy development and bridging gaps and all that, at the end of the day, you then have to depend on specific institutions that have budgets for their own sectors, and that doesn't help. So we need to have a situation where there is considerable reorientation of investment in food system transformation, not just for the biological side of the agenda, but also with great attention to dealing with social, institutional, and political dimensions of innovation and transformation. You know, you need to create a fund that enables that to happen. And I think that is one of the key elements we are embarking on within the 1CGIAR system, is really to be able to identify these innovative, complex issues where we can put a budget down and we all work together to try to see how that budget helps to address the specific issue we are talking about. And in doing that, talking about budgets, we should also always remember the stakeholders who may not belong to the institution. You are dealing with national programs, you are dealing with regional organizations, etc. You are dealing with non-governmental organizations, and oftentimes they are not factored into the budget that is necessary to drive food systems. So I think that is actually needed to make sure that we can achieve the goals that are set within the food systems transformation agenda.
Thank you very much, Kwesi, and thank you for explaining how complex it is. And maybe just a reminder, if we have 3 billion people that are employed by agri-food system, that shows how complex it is. If you want to really touch upon all sectors and bring them in a system thinking, it's really very complex, and maybe the models we have of governance right now are not the best suited for it. So thank you very much to the 3 panelists for really giving us your experience, sharing with us your insight. It was very interesting, and I'm sure many of the people with us online have a lot of questions, and maybe even more questions than when we started this webinar. So there is more to be said around the subject, and we all recognize its complexity, but we all also recognize that we need to do it. We need to have a system thinking approach if we want to really counterattack the challenges we have today. With that, I'm going to pass the closing remark to Dr. Stefanos Foutiou, who is an accomplished expert on sustainable development. He is currently our director of the Office of SDGs at FAO, and he's also serving as the director of the UN Food System Coordination Hub. Over to you, Stefanos.
Ismahani, thank you very much for your introduction. Pleasure to come from you. So I'll just get 2 minutes to say that I listen to a lot of interesting things. System thinking as a diagnostic mode, system thinking as a framework to put together policies, system thinking as a framework to evaluate policies. I think all is valid, and I really see the diversity of solutions that the systems thinking can provide. We need really to answer one fundamental question that is coming from the policymakers. You said this, Mahani, in the opening, that many policymakers perceive the systems thinking as a theoretical model. So we need to make sure that system thinking is becoming a practical tool for them when they design policies, when they evaluate policies, and when they implement policies. And something extremely important, and I've seen this all these years that I work with governments, is to make the system thinking approach going to the budgeting approach. The budgets that are happening either by governments, but not only by governments, by institutions, by the private sector, are extremely sectoral. They are looking at sectoral allocations and at very specific achievements that they are not system-based achievements. So we need a very big effort, I think, to change the way that we are thinking about, not only about the design of the policies, but about the budgeting, which is the one that will make the policies happen. I'm very pleased that we have all this group of experts and very pleased to see the big audience today in this webinar. We will continue from our side to organize these food system solution webinars and the dialogues that they have another format. And I thank all of you very much for your time. You, Ismahani, for moderating all of this, but especially Livia, Kwesi, and Tom for giving your expertise here. Thank you very much, and see you in the next Food System Solution Dialogue, which is on 23 of November, webinar on 23 of November, and it's about innovation in food systems. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.